Good morning. I'm Joyce Tischler, your worship associate today. Dreams and passions have given me purpose in life. They've been my guides and my road signs. I'm thankful that I live in a time where women are finally allowed to follow their dreams. I remember when my third grade teacher asked us to write an essay about what career we wanted when we grew up. I was adamant, at least in my own mind, that I would not be a nurse or a teacher. And don't get me wrong, those are noble professions, but those were the two that women were most often funneled into when I was a little kid. And I rebelled against the idea that I was preordained to settle for a traditional female role. I wrote that I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I was damn careful that I spelled it right. And I proudly brought that essay home to my parents, who were very pleased. My father had wanted to be a vet when he was young, but he didn't pursue it. My brother was already heading into that profession. But math and science were not my strong suit. And in the heyday of the 1960s, I was drawn to a more activist career. I was going to change the world. I was a teenager in the 1960s. I attended college and law school in the 1970s. And with the rise of the feminist movement, it seemed infinitely possible for women to drink? No, for women. Yeah, we could do that too. But it was now possible for us to dream big. And I ate up feminism. It was telling me that I could do and be anything I wanted to be. Feminists were telling me to question the status quo of male-female relationships. Unfortunately, most of the men I met seemed quite clueless about the feminist revolution. They were quite comfortable with the status quo, and they saw no need to change. And it took me a long while to find a man who wasn't afraid of me and my ideas. I turned 15 in 1968, and I spent that amazing summer working at the Queens, New York, Democratic headquarters for Eugene McCarthy for president. And that experience was life-affirming and life-changing for me. I'm not sure how, but I thought nothing of standing on street corners in Queens and debating with middle-aged men about the Vietnam War. I stuffed a gazillion envelopes. I felt alive and motivated, and for the first time, I met people who were lawyers and who were going to change the world. And that was an aha moment. Aha, that's what I want to become. I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm going to change the world. It was a big, bold career choice, and I never questioned that decision from that moment on. In the mid to late 1970s, I went to law school, and women constituted about 1/3 of the law school class. My criminal law professor thought nothing of referring to a D&C as a dust and clean. We advised him that that was no longer an appropriate thing to say. For those who have not experienced law school, it is 3 years of stress and misery that I would not wish on my worst enemy. One day, I was sitting in the cafeteria with several other of my women colleagues, and we were commiserating our outcast fate, when someone asked why we had decided to go to law school. And to a person, each woman admitted that her parents had given her very strong support to take this road. Another aha. We had dreamed of a career that was bigger than we were, and our parents had the foresight to believe in us, even though they were raised in a generation in which women were homemakers, mothers, maybe secretaries. We made it to where we were because we had their faith and their backing. And I've tried to follow that model in raising my own gorgeous daughter. Well, here we are. It's 2024. And as frustrating and scary as it is that MAGA Republicans are trying to take away women's reproductive rights, widen the gender pay gap. Sorry, I was going to say gay pap. And otherwise, we're trying to return women of this country to 1890. I want to quote that obnoxious old cigarette ad, "We've come a long way, baby, and we ain't going back."
I wanted to take just a moment today and hold an event that is happening tomorrow. Tomorrow is the anniversary of October 7th. It is the anniversary of the day that Hamas went into Israel, and in one of the more shocking events in a long time, killed several hundred people and took hostages that were as young as 4. It was a horrific event. And unfortunately, Israel's response to that horrific event has been even more horrific. 40,000 people in Gaza are dead, and most people in Gaza have no homes left or are not able to be in their homes safely. We hold them all. We in the United States know something about responses that didn't match the horrific events that happened. It doesn't lessen the horrific event, but you also lose the moral high ground at some point. I just wanted to share this today, to speak it out loud. I know that so many of us are so worried and horrified about what is happening in the Middle East. And I wanted to read a poem by the Reverend Drew Patton called "I Side with the People." He is the minister of the First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley. And he wrote, "If ever they ask you, which side are you on? Tell them plainly, I side with the people, with the precious ones, all, the integral, the soft and the fierce, irreplaceable, the beloved, if only by God and trees, who are born, who breathe and survive. Say, I side with those who keep watch beneath the bright screaming arc of bombs, with those who hide in dark doorways, or who through the midnight flee, with those who stay and fight, and with those kept up all night by hunger and grief and terror and rage, by desperate, unruly hope, who are good and green at the root, who are more than the worst they've done, who do their best to love and still pass on the hurt in themselves that they hate. But what when they take sides against each other? The people against even themselves, side with whatever is human among them, what is fragile and feeling and flesh. Side with the truth of our stories. Side with the fact of our pain. Side with defiant insistence on freedom. Side there again and again. Side there today and tomorrow. Side there the rest of your life. Side there until we belong, each one to every other. If ever they ask you, which side are you on, say, it doesn't work like that. Tell them you side with the people and abide where the people are at. Our reading is from Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery. And then, for one glorious, supreme moment, came the flash. It had always seemed to Emily, ever since she could remember, that she was very, very near to a world of wonderful beauty. Between it and herself hung only a thin curtain. She could never draw the curtain aside, but sometimes, just for a moment, the wind fluttered it, and then it was as if she caught a glimpse of the enchanting realm beyond, only a glimpse, and heard a note of unearthly music. This moment came rarely, went swiftly, leaving her breathless with the inexpressible delight of it all. She could never recall it, never summon it, never pretend it. But the wonder of it stayed with her for days. It never came twice with the same thing. Tonight, the dark boughs against that far-off sky had given it. It had come with a high, wild note of wind in the night, the shadow wave over a ripe field, with a gray bird lighting on her windowsill in a storm, with the singing of holy, holy, holy in church, with a glimpse of the kitchen fire when she had come home on a dark autumn night, with the spirit-like blue of ice palms on a twilit pane, with the felicitous new word when she was writing down a description of something. And always, when the flash came to her, Emily felt that life was a wonderful, mysterious thing of persistent beauty. This sermon was purchased by Ray Hastings at our auction last year. She asked me to preach about Lucy Maud Montgomery and her much beloved children's books, the best known of which is Anne of Green Gables. One of Ray's favorite of the follow-up series is a later book, Emily of New Moon. Both of those books are on our altar today. Like Anne, Emily is a very smart girl who is enraptured by the natural world. You heard that in our reading. Like Anne, Emily is an orphan who is raised by people previously unknown to her. But while Anne's story is of a girl orphaned as an infant and raised in a terrible orphanage and earning her keep taking care of other people's children, Emily has lived with her beloved father after her mother's death, and after his death, when she was about 8, is taken in by relatives of her mother's who she has never met before. But they can't let blood go without care. Anne is finding the first family of her remembered life, while Emily has lost the parent who adored her and is taken in by people she believes are just doing their duty, but don't really want her. But while the specifics of their stories may be different, both Anne and Emily are bright, inquisitive children with strong imaginations who rejoice in the natural world. And it became clear to me as we talked why Ray finds such kinship with the characters. Ray was raised in the woods near Sandy, up on Mount Hood. She's the oldest of 5 kids, so as she put it, had built-in playmates, which was especially helpful because all of the kids were homeschooled until she started high school. The family was active in a Foursquare church, and that and a weekly homeschool group were Ray's major social circles. Like Emily, Ray found much joy and happiness in her childhood through the magic of books and through the beauty of the natural world, 2 things I also know well. And like the author of the books, L.M. Montgomery, Ray has dealt with depression. One of the things Ray loves about the book so much is that the author's own struggles come through in the novels. Montgomery's mother died of tuberculosis when she was just 21 months old, and her father, consumed with grief, left her in the care of her maternal grandparents in Cavendish on Prince Edward Island. He lived nearby for the next 5 years, but eventually moved to Saskatchewan, where he remarried a woman Maud didn't get along with. Maud, which was the name Montgomery went by as a child, like her character Anne, was a lonely kid who used her imagination and her love of nature to make a lonely life worth living. She probably shared feelings of rejection with her characters, feeling like no one really understood her. One of the reasons Montgomery's characters, especially Anne, have survived and been beloved for so long is that she writes of what so many of us want to be, an interesting person. Anne worries about her looks, Emily worries about not getting published as an author, but primarily they both worry about not being loved. Who among us hasn't had a moment of not feeling loved? It was a romantic era in children's books, an age of dearest father and bosom friends, an age where a girl with an imagination and a big vocabulary could shine. But sometimes it's not easy to be a person with an imagination and a big vocabulary. Sometimes people like that get picked on. Anne of Green Gables shares a lot with many other female heroines of children's books written over 100 years ago. With few modern distractions, playing outdoors was something everyone with time to play did. But playing alone outside can often get fairly dull. How much better to draw on one's imagination, to tell stories and make up imaginary friends. Characters like Laura Ingalls and Caddie Woodlawn explored outside in ways that went beyond assumptions of what proper little girls did. But they both did so from a safe and loving family structure. Anne and most of Montgomery's other characters didn't have that same sense of stability, even in the midst of hardship, that characters like Laura Ingalls did. And so for characters like Anne and Emily, and frankly their author, their own imaginations were crucial to their senses of self. And while adult readers of the book may be able to see some of the affection Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert and Aunt Elizabeth and Aunt Laura have for their young charges, we do understand that the girls don't see that at first, that they need some proof of that love and belonging, and bless them, it does come eventually. But first, there is a great sense of injustice that happens all too often when a young girl is not treated like a whole human being, but instead like a child, someone to be seen and not heard. Boy, parenting has changed. Or worse, an orphan or an outsider, someone not worthy of the same respect we give adults. In Anne of Green Gables, Ms. Rachel Lynde, the neighbor who warns Marilla of orphans and how you can't trust them, says truly unkind things to a child, pointing out how skinny and homely she is with her red hair and ugly freckles. When Anne responds in kind, she is sent to her room until she apologizes, which she does in her own florid way, and the two eventually become close. In Emily of New Moon, when Emily's teacher, who has never been kind to her, discovers her secret stash of writing and takes it and reads it out loud with much sarcasm in front of the entire class, and then goes to burn it, saying it can't possibly be Emily's work, Emily snatches the papers from her hand and runs away. And her teacher, Miss Brownwell, comes to her home to tell her Aunt Elizabeth what an impudent and rude child she is. Emily begs for a chance to tell her side of the story, but she's not even allowed that. Aunt Elizabeth has heard the story from a grown-up and doesn't even consider that it could be false or not the whole story. Aunt Elizabeth attempts to make Emily apologize to her teacher and tries to make her actually kneel in supplication in front of her teacher for the apology, which is a bridge too far for Emily. Miss Brownwell looked pleased and expectant. It would be very satisfying to see this child who had defied her kneeling before her as a penitent. Never again, Miss Brownwell felt, would Emily be able to look levelly at her with those dauntless eyes that bespoke a soul untamable and free, no matter what punishment might be inflicted on body or mind. The memory of this moment would always be with Emily. She could never forget that she had knelt in a basement. Aunt Elizabeth, please let me tell my side of the story, she pleaded. I have heard all I wish of the matter. You will do as I say, Emily, or you will be outcast in this house until you do. No one will talk to you, play with you, eat with you, have anything to do with you until you have obeyed me. Fortunately for Emily, her cousin Jimmy points out that no person should kneel in front of anyone except God. And Emily is able to apologize in a way that pleases Aunt Elizabeth enough, and Miss Brownwell is denied her triumph. And eventually, to everyone's satisfaction, Aunt Elizabeth realizes that she can't treat a child as if they were not a person. Elizabeth Murray had learned an important lesson, that there was not one law of fairness for children and another for grown-ups. She continued to be as autocratic as ever, but she did not do or say anything to Emily that she would not have done or said to Elizabeth's sister Laura, had occasion called for it. There are other similarities between Ella Montgomery and her characters, and there are ways in which her publisher forced her into plot lines she didn't wish. Ms. Montgomery was a very spiritual person. The paragraphs about the flash from Emily of New Moon, from our reading today, are almost verbatim from Montgomery's own diary, writing about her experiences. She too lived all her early life on Prince Edward Island and is one of the world's most admired Canadians. I got to see Prince Edward Island with my dad last spring, and it is a beautiful place. She too loved the spirituality of nature, finding sustenance and inspiration in beautiful places. In a biography written by Mary Rubio, she noted that in 1905, Montgomery wrote in her journal, "Amid the commonplaces of life, I was very near to a kingdom of ideal beauty. Between it and me hung only a thin veil. I could never quite draw it aside, but sometimes a wind fluttered it. I seemed to catch a glimpse of the enchanting realm beyond, only a glimpse, but those glimpses had always made life worthwhile." Montgomery went to a teacher's college and taught school as she worked on her writing and published many short stories and poems. During her teaching years, she was pursued by several men, most of whom she wasn't interested in beyond friendship. She became engaged to a man named Edward Simpson because she feared for her prospects, but the love of her life was a man named Herman Leard, with whom she had a brief but passionate relationship while both of them were engaged to other people. On April 8th, 1998, in her diary, Montgomery wrote that she had to stay faithful to Simpson. "For the sake of my self-respect, I must not stoop to any sort of an affair with another man." She then wrote, "If I had, or rather, if I could have kept this resolve, I would have saved myself from incalculable suffering. For it was but a few days later that I found myself face to face with the burning consciousness that I loved Herman Leard with a wild, passionate, unreasoning love that dominated my entire being and poisoned me like a flame. A love I could neither quell nor control, a love that its intensity seemed little short of absolute madness. Madness, yes." And the interesting thing about this is that her actual marriage, which happened 15 years later to a Presbyterian minister, was so much less satisfying. He was extremely depressed, mostly because he believed that he wasn't one of the elect, and so he wouldn't be going to heaven. And so he was just miserable and made his family miserable about this. And so Montgomery stayed single from this 1898 until 1911, when she was focused on writing novels and taking care of her grandmother. She married in 1915. It wasn't a good marriage. She considered divorce, and I think the thing that I read said there were 298 divorces granted in the 6,000 people in Canada in that era. So even considering it took a lot. But both she and her husband suffered from depression, and MacDonald suffered from paranoia as well, partially because one of his depression medications once got coated in insecticide accidentally by the pharmacist. So, that would give you a reason to be paranoid, I suppose. Those feelings that she had of being trapped in a loveless marriage, the unhappiness, her horror at the First World War, which she just constantly read the news and was just horrified at what was going on there. And those came through in her books in some ways. She finally married Anne off to Gilbert Blythe at the demand of her publisher. But if you read the books, Montgomery didn't find marriage the ultimate joy in a woman's life. In 2008, on the 100th anniversary of the publication of Anne of Green Gables, Montgomery's granddaughter revealed for the first time that the author's death in 1942 had in fact been suicide. She said it was time to stop carrying the secret and asked for more care and an end to secrecy and shame surrounding mental illness. It's a little challenging to realize that books that were so beloved, that meant so much to so many lonely children and adults, were written in part from a need to support oneself and from a sense of obligation. But I think if we look closer, we see that that's one of the reasons that they survive. Montgomery valued friendship and beauty and love and the natural world, and she didn't always get that. One of the many tragedies of her life was the death of her best friend when they were in their 20s. But the way she wrote about the longing for those things struck a chord in readers that continues to this day. Joy and woe are woven fine, as William Blake said, and perhaps nowhere more finely than in tales of orphan girls who find their own beauty and joy. In Emily of New Moon, Emily's father has recently died. She is living with aunts who have taken her in out of obligation, and her cousin Jimmy, who suffered a head injury many years ago. The book states, again, there was that eerie, indefinable something in cousin Jimmy's voice or look that gave Emily a sudden crinkly feeling in her spine. But she loved the way he talked to her, as if she were a grown-up. And she loved the beautiful land around her. And in spite of the ache for her father and the house in the hollow, which persisted all the time and hurt her so much at night that her pillow was wet with secret tears, she was beginning to be a little glad again in sunset and bird songs and early white stars, in moonlit nights and singing winds. She knew life was going to be wonderful here, wonderful and interesting. We all suffer from loss and death and disappointment. But we too can have a life that is wonderful and interesting if only we make it so. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.